So, ladies and gentlemen, André Picard.
Well, what happened, Anton, is we drew straws and I got the short straw, so I'm first. So, it's nice to see it's like school, everybody crowding at the back. Some things never change. So, Dr. Goldbloom is going to be second. He had the longer straw, and he's going to give you this fascinating multimedia presentation about mental illness through the ages. How's that for putting you on the spot? But I'm much more low-tech, and so I'm going to just talk to you. I don't have any slides except this wonderful slide of Dr. Goldbloom hard at work, which he's always doing. And I'm going to stick to a very narrow topic. I'm going to talk about suicide in the media because it's very timely and a lot of stuff going on today and a lot of issues about how the media portrays suicide. So that's what I'm going to talk about. There's this widely accepted belief that the media has an important role in how suicide plays out, that we're the cause of it in many cases. So I want to address that. There's a theory that media coverage can incite people to take their own lives. They call that theory the contagion effect. So that's what I'm going to address this morning. So as some of you may know, the Canadian Psychiatric Association has published a series of guidelines for the media to try and quell this bloodshed. They think the media is playing a bad role. And I'm going to be critical of these guidelines, but I think they're well-intentioned and they're not all bad. But I want to talk a bit about why they have these guidelines. And why did I pick this topic? Well, of course, there's a lot going on. We've all read about Amanda Todd, the Vancouver teen who died by suicide after posting a video on YouTube about bullying. And just a few days ago, the Vancouver School Board, in response to this, published essentially a plea saying essentially the media shouldn't cover teen suicide except in exceptional circumstances, that thought the coverage of Amanda Todd was terrible, and so on. So I want to talk about this contagion effect. But before I do that, I want to start with some numbers, because I work at the Globe and we love numbers, especially if they have dollar signs in front of them. But I'm going to talk about non-dollar sign numbers and talk about suicide numbers. So about 10 people a day in Canada die by suicide. Another 50 self-harm is the terminology, which is essentially a euphemism for suicide attempts or cutting. And I have to note that those are only the numbers of people who land in hospital. So it's only the ones who are counted. So it's probably an underestimate, these numbers. But the flip side of the coin is not everyone who cuts or self-harms is trying to kill themselves. We have to bear that in mind too. Some people say there's an epidemic of suicide. I think we have to be careful with that word. But let me give you some other numbers. There are an estimated 800,000 Canadians a year who seriously consider suicide. So this is based on polling data, etc. And about 230,000 of them actually make a detailed suicide plan. So that's pretty serious, some issues. And those latter two numbers, I have to say, are extrapolated from US data. They have much better data. I haven't seen strictly Canadian numbers on this. But the point is that the people dying is just the tip of the iceberg. There's much more going on, and almost all of it related to mental health issues, which is the single biggest cause of suicide and suicide attempts is people with untreated or inadequately treated mental illness. Now, I haven't seen any good evidence that suggests that suicide or suicidal ideation, as the term is used, is on the rise. It seems to be pretty steady over the years. What we seem to be getting better at is counting and actually talking about it. So people are much more open. There's a little less stigma about discussing suicide. It's not as shameful to discuss it as it's been for a long time. And it's not illegal, by the way, in Canada. Some people think suicide is illegal. It's not. It was until the 1970s. What else do the data tell us? Data tell us that a lot more men than women die of suicide, a ratio of about 3 to 1, but that there are far more suicide attempts among women. They just tend to use less violent methods, so there's not as much death. And we, of course, know that there are certain groups where suicide is much more common. Aboriginal people, teenagers, seniors, prison inmates, gays and lesbians, and of course people who suffer a diagnosable mental illness, especially severe mental illness like schizophrenia. Now, if it's not obvious from that catalog of groups, I should point out that these are not people who tend to get coverage in the mainstream media. They're very marginalized populations. And that's part of the issue, being marginalized. And finally, the last little bit of numbers I want to give you is to point out that this is not just a Canadian problem, it's really a global issue. Worldwide, there are, according to the World Health Organization, 815,000 suicides a year. By comparison, there's about 520,000 murders worldwide in any given year, and 310,000 people who die in armed conflicts, like wars, terrorist attacks, etc. But unlike murders and terrorist acts and fatalities of war, suicide deaths tend to be pretty invisible, with very few exceptions. And just one comparative number I should give you for Canada is there's about 600 murders in Canada a year, so that means there's 6 times as many suicides as murders. Terrorist attacks, as far as I know, there were none last year in Canada. So. Now, in the media, we cover a fraction of the murders and even a smaller fraction of the suicides. We don't cover everything, and that's entirely appropriate. There are reasons that we cover stuff. We tend to cover suicide deaths for the same reason we cover other deaths. They merit coverage if there's another issue involved, say bullying, as in the Amanda Todd case. If the death involves a high-profile person, we all know about the Kurt Cobain suicide, or if there's unusual circumstances. The media tends to write about unusual things, not usual ones. The example, current one, is the nurse involved in the royal baby hoax. So that's unusual. Normally, we wouldn't cover the suicide of a nurse. Or I should say alleged suicide. It's not clear in that case. I happen to think we should cover suicides exactly the same way we cover everything else, meaning in these exceptional circumstances, and ideally we should cover them the way we should cover everything else, accurately and respectfully, and with some purpose, some larger social message in there beyond strict voyeurism. And I think we do pretty well. The media is certainly not perfect, but we do okay. But there are many people who think that suicide coverage requires special rules, and that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. So the CPA, Canadian Psychiatric Association guidelines, do a couple of things. They urge reporters and editors to avoid the following things. Let me just give you the list. Avoid giving details of the suicide method, using the word suicide in the headline, publishing photos or, quote, admiration of the deceased, unquote, repetitive, excessive, or front-page coverage. This is my favorite one, exciting reporting. We shouldn't have any exciting reporting. We should not cite romanticized or simplistic reasons for the suicide, or state that suicide is unexplainable, or show any approval of the suicide. So those are the rules they've set out. Again, well-meaning, not unreasonable, but I question whether they're necessary. So what's the justification for this? Why do we need special rules that we don't need for murder, for covering cancer, etc.? And I'll read you from the introduction of the CPA guidelines. Quote, there's a significant evidence base demonstrating that media reporting of suicides is linked to copycat suicides, particularly among youth and young people under 24 years of age. It has been deemed reasonable to believe that a causal link exists between the reporting of suicides in newspaper and television and copycat suicides in the community. Now, that's terrible writing, but you get the point. So, what's the evidence that they cite? Now, the notion that reading about suicide will provoke suicides goes back centuries, specifically to this 1774 novel by Goethe. Goethe wrote a book entitled The Sorrow of Young Werther. And it's about a dandy young man who can't live with the pain of unrequited love, and he shoots himself. Now, apparently before they had cheesy Celine Dion love songs, they had Goethe novels that were cheesy. But that's beside the point. Anyhow, this book was very popular. It was the 50 Shades of Grey of its time, but it was a little darker, I guess, maybe 50 Shades of really depressing. And it prompted, apparently, a wave of suicides all over Europe. And in fact, they termed the coin, psychiatrists termed the coin the Werther effect, of people would dress up the way this guy dressed up, which is a fancy dress, and then they would shoot themselves. And this became such a problem, apparently, that many countries actually banned men from dressing like Werther, with a fancy hat and a feather, etc. Suicide was already illegal, so they didn't have to do that. So that goes back. So we've had this notion for a long time. But there's more contemporary evidence that's used to justify these rules. So I'll give you a couple of these examples. During a newspaper strike in Detroit in 1970, researchers found that the suicide rate went down. So this is, well, that's a good thing. If newspapers don't publish, no one will die. And in fact, the murder rate went down in Detroit substantially during the newspaper strike as well. But nobody suggested we shouldn't write about murders, especially in Detroit, because there'd be nothing in the paper. But that's another example. There was a similar phenomenon during a New York newspaper strike a few years after Detroit, but in that case, the suicide rate fell only among young women. Interesting. Not exactly the prime newspaper audience, but still interesting finding. But the most cited research on the topic actually comes from Austria. So in the mid-1980s, in Vienna, there was extensive coverage of subway suicides. There were a lot of them. And it was pretty gory tabloid stuff with gruesome pictures and everything. And researchers found that the number of suicides rose quite dramatically. And this got more coverage and a vicious circle. And the researchers found that those who attempted suicide by jumping in front of a train, that 82% of them had, quote, been exposed to the media. Suspicious stuff. And then they found that when coverage changed, when they stopped giving extensive coverage to this, that suicides fell. So this is cited as the strongest evidence of the copycat effect. So I'm not an academic, but I spend a lot of time reading research, mostly medical research. So I do so with a critical eye. So I went back and read this stuff. And my opinion, and it's just an opinion, an uninformed one, is that this research is pretty weak. And I think some of the conclusions are pretty dubious, in fact. So I want to look at some of the stuff that you don't read about this research, because I think some of the links are tenuous. So let's look at Austria, because that's the most cited one. It's true that there was evidence of imitative behavior. More people jumped in front of the suicide, there's no question. But there's actually no evidence that the number of suicides went up overall. So what the media seems to have influenced is the method of suicide. So in fact, people jumping off bridges, which is a very common form of suicide, went down in Vienna, but jumping in front of trains went up. I think the media, if nothing else, sent the message that this was an effective means. So that's an important issue, I think, that what do you influence? Is it just method or overall number of suicides? Now, the Austrian Association for Suicide Prevention produced something they called the Media Guidelines for Safe Reporting, and these have been copied by many countries over the years, including the Canadian rules are sort of based on this. And over the next 5 years after these guidelines were published, suicide deaths in the subway system went down 75%. So this is cited as an example of, well, guidelines are good, they save lives. So I think there's no doubt that media coverage improved. The issue became more prominent. We thought about it, or the media thought about it more, they were more careful in their coverage, all good things. But I think we also forget some other factors. Resources allocated to suicide prevention went up dramatically because of this, and so did public awareness. So that may have had an influence. But what I found interesting is one thing that was almost never mentioned in discussing this is that the Vienna subway system also built barriers. They built anti-suicide barriers. So it's really difficult to throw yourself in front of a train. Now, I'm not sure if that had any effect. It was probably all the media. But if there's cement blocks and you can't do it, there's probably a pretty good reason that the numbers fell dramatically. So this is all my way of saying we have to be careful about associations. Now, aside from the methodology, I think you should also notice that all this research cited is pretty old. It all was published well before Al Gore invented the internet in the 1990s. And we all know the world has changed a lot since then. The media especially. So what are these rules still appropriate in the 1990s? There's really been a communications revolution in recent years. So why do we have rules based on a time when newspapers reigned the world? And That day has long passed, sadly, for some of us. So let me take a look at the first high-profile suicide of the internet age, and that was Kurt Cobain. So he died in April 1994, and he was the lead singer of a group called Nirvana, big, prominent rock star. Now, the coverage of that death broke all the rules. Kurt Cobain killed himself using a shotgun, we know that. We had detailed descriptions of how this could be done, because it's not easy. Your arms have to be long, but you can use a string, etc. Very detailed explanations of the methodology. The word suicide was in the headline, of course, repeatedly. On the front page, absolutely. Was there admiration of the deceased? Like you wouldn't believe. He was glorified, deified, you name it. Some might even call it excited reporting. There was a fair bit of that, because he was a rock star. You could even view the gory crime scene photos online. There wasn't a lot of restrictions. This was the Wild West of the internet, probably even worse than it is today. He was probably as glorified as anyone ever has been in print or on TV. So what happened? Was there a spike in teen suicides because their idol died in this way? A lot of shotgun deaths? A rash of copycat suicides? In fact, there was none of that. None of that happened. There was actually a little bit of evidence that suicides fell because of the attention paid to this, kids going to get help, people worrying about their friends, talking about Kurt Cobain, etc., getting them help. So not the expected effect. Now, it's not 1774 anymore either, but that was interesting. What happened with Amanda Todd? Same thing. Has there been a rash of copycat suicides in teenagers? I think the media would have been all over them if there was even one. There don't seem to be any evidence of that. Yet the Vancouver School Board says we need stricter rules. We shouldn't have covered Amanda Todd hardly at all. I guess not because it made them look terrible, but for other reasons. They say it's the coverage is increasing suicidal thoughts among teenagers. Again, not a lot of hard evidence, a lot of speculation. Now, the last thing I would say is, in this day and age, does anyone seriously believe that teenagers read newspapers? I have a couple of them living in my home, and I don't think they've ever touched the newspaper. They have their iPads and their iPhones and their this and their that. They get all their news about suicide and otherwise from Facebook and Twitter and texts and YouTube and The Daily Show featuring Jon Stewart, which is the only news show that people under 24 know exists. Now, it's interesting that there are no guidelines recommended for cyberspace, and I'm not sure there could be. If there was, I don't think they'd probably be even less effective than with newspapers. So I think the best we can do is try and equip people, and young people in particular, with some critical thinking skills. And I think I have I talk for another hour about that, about the need for our education system to equip people to be healthier, but I think that's the issue for me. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there. And just let me restate, if it's not already obvious, that I'm actually a proponent of more coverage of mental health and of suicide in particular, not less. Now, I want responsible, interesting, informative coverage, not voyeurism, but I think that will benefit more than anything else. I think that the hush-hush attitude about suicide, all it's done over the years is create more stigma, and it's done a lot more harm than good. So I'm going to stop there and turn over the floor to Dr. Goldbloom. Look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Well, if any of you came here looking for a dog fight, you're going to be bitterly disappointed. Andre had the advantage, obviously, of speaking first and saying pretty well everything that I was hoping to talk with you about this morning. I should say, though, as you came in and you heard the final strains of Glenn Gould's second recording of the Goldberg Variations in a film by Bruno Mont-Saint-Jean, that we should remember this is, in fact, 2012 is the 30th anniversary of Glenn Gould's death, the 80th anniversary of his birth in this city, and that he embodied one of those people who very clearly experienced episodes of mental illness, coupled with episodes of extraordinary and sustained creativity. Probably the unique pianist of the 20th century, and on another occasion, we would have an opportunity to go into the mind and brain of Glenn Gould, which has been a long fascination of mine as a former member of the Glenn Gould Foundation. I want to take a bit of a historical perspective and begin with a quote from André's newspaper. This was written just shortly before André was hired. It's from the Saturday Globe, April 5, 1890. André was a cub reporter, and this was about a visit to the hospital where I happened to have the privilege of working, CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. Its forebear at that time, in 1890, was the Provincial Lunatic Asylum, which was its official name from 1850 forward. And on the front page of the Globe, forget the back page, this was on the front page and the full front page, April 5, 1890. The headline was, "At the Asylum, a visit to a great provincial institution." And here's what the copy reads. "Insanity. Does not the word bring to the recollection of almost every reader some face, a friend, a relative perhaps, of one who, though living, is counted among the dead? What sad chapters in many a family history have been written and must be written to the end of time, bearing that terrible title, Insanity? Where is the mind so inflexible as to view undisturbed, or the heart so adamantine as to pass without sadness the tomb of the living dead?" So that was the description of my hospital, the tomb of the living dead. And now I would say, first of all, in terms of ornate language and slightly rococo turn of phrase, you won't find writing like that in the Globe and Mail anymore, and I think that's actually a bit of a loss. But it reflects how people with mental illness were essentially viewed 120 years ago. Let's flash forward to October 19, 2006, when a young reporter, André Picard, full head of hair, was describing a ravishing brunette, me, at a round table on mental health and the arts held at the National Arts Center. And he quoted me as saying that I was debunking the myth that artists must be creative. While many artists suffer from mental illness, so too do people in all walks of life. Mood disorders do not confer destiny, he said. In fact, mental illness hampers creativity, and treating mental illness lets creativity out of the bottle and into our lives. André then went on to say that the starting point in terms of changing the scene should be the creation of a Canadian Mental Health Commission. Such an announcement would be music to the ears of anyone who has ever witnessed a family member suffer from depression or grappled with mental illness themselves. It would provide a bit of hope in the midst of the current public policy hell. So there was some ornate language there from André. He gave you some facts about suicide. And it is close to 1 million people a year, according to the World Health Organization, who die by suicide every year. And, you know, if you look at the military, which is a particular focus of suicide in terms of the populations that André targeted, in 2010, in the U.S. Armed Forces, there were more deaths by suicide than deaths by combat in Afghanistan and Iraq. It is a huge issue for the U.S. military. And in the United States, deaths from suicide vastly outstripped deaths from AIDS in the last 20 years, but garnered nowhere near the attention. So I'm in fact on the same page as André around the need for better and more coverage of suicide and its multiple determinants, because suicide is simply the tragic and dark end of a number of journeys through mental illness, through all kinds of adversity, and our natural tendency in all things medical and beyond is to find false associations and simple explanations. And that's the case for suicide, no differently than it is for anything else. I won't obviously tell you about the the Werther effect, because it's been so well described by André, but a report in 1974 on this by Phillips was really the triggering moment for the promulgation of media guidelines. And in fact, they came out from the Centers for Disease Control long before they came out from the Canadian Psychiatric Association. So the CDC in Atlanta published its own guidelines, which I think are legitimate today, which include avoiding presenting simplistic explanations. And that continues today. This most recent alleged suicide of this nurse is already, there is a straight line being drawn without interruption, without modification, without elaboration between this radio prank and this woman's tragic death. And it demeans everybody's journey, frankly, to draw those very clear and simple lines. They also warned against providing how-to descriptions. I have to say, in the 21st century, you can keep it out of the newspaper, but you're kidding yourself if you think you're keeping it out of circulation. It's estimated there are over 100,000 websites related to suicide, many of which include highly explicit instructions for people on how to end their lives. They have said to avoid glorifying people who die by suicide. You know, I have a problem with this because there is much to celebrate in the lives of people who die by suicide. And it seems wrong to me that all of the things that they have accomplished throughout their lives should somehow be obliterated or obscured by the tragedy of their death. They even suggested avoiding focusing on the person's strengths and minimizing their difficulties, as if it's an either-or, right? And the reality is, for me, in 30 years of working with people with mental illness, they come into the hospital or into my office with a set of strengths and a set of difficulties. And there's no reason in the recognition of their full humanity that you can't pay attention to both. The CPA guidelines that were so well dissected by André, I think do reflect late 20th century thinking, and we're so far into the 21st century that they need to be seriously reconsidered because they run the risk of the unwitting conspiracy of silence about suicide. And for all the media coverage that exists about suicide, there remains a conspiracy of silence, and you will find it in the newspaper, but you won't find it in the news section. Where will you find it? This is a short snapper open to either side. Okay, in the obituaries. That's where you find the conspiracy of silence. That's where you see the 35-year-old lawyer or doctor or teacher died suddenly. No explanation is given, and no charity is named, because the charities are usually the clue to the cause of death, the Cancer Society, Heart and Stroke, whatever. Now, that tide is beginning to shift, and remember that people don't simply die in our military metaphor of the obituary, which is they always lose a courageous battle with cancer. They lose a courageous battle with dementia. I actually think this is a terrible metaphor approach because it says that the person's essentially a loser, right? People die of things. I don't think that they've actually lost a battle that other people are winning. They've died, and that's sad, and that's tragic, but that's the metaphor that exists. Given that that is the metaphor that exists, you are now starting to see, particularly in the last 5 years, obituaries that read, lost a courageous battle with depression, with schizophrenia. And they will name a mental health charity in the obituary. And I mean, we've even had the phenomenon of our Prime Minister speaking quite movingly at the funeral of a former parliamentarian who died by suicide. and talking about the reality of mental illness. So I think we are in changing times. However, are they changing as fast as we would like? There is a paper that will be coming out in February 2013 from Rob Whitley at McGill University, who has done an exhaustive study of mentions of mental illness, schizophrenia, and schizophrenic. Those were his search engine words in the top 20 Canadian newspapers in the English language. So I think the Globe and Mail made the cut, right? They unearthed over 11,000 articles in this search of articles published between 2005 and 2010. And what they looked at were themes that emerged from those articles. And without going into all the details of this in-press publication, although I have seen an advanced copy, 40% of the articles talk about mental illness, mental health, schizophrenia, schizophrenic, in the context of danger, violence, and criminality. So that's where almost half of the references to mental health have been in the papers from 2005 to 2010. Treatment for mental illness, less than 20% of the articles. The idea of recovery, the idea that people get better, that they move on with their lives, less than 20%. The vast majority of these articles had no quotes from people with mental illness themselves. So that those voices, which are important voices, remain largely silent in the media. Now, we know that there have been counterweights, and CAMH is among the people who've been involved in championing the voices of people with mental illness, whether it's in those subway ads or on television, but largely those voices are not heard. And surprising to me, most of the articles had no quotes from people with expertise in mental illness from the research and treatment point of view. The advantage of doing a study like this over 5 years is it allows you to look at trends across time, right? Is there evidence that this is changing? Well, I'm sorry to tell you that the evidence so far is it's not changing, and it may be too soon, much like the Chinese quotation about whether democracy is going to be successful, but it's too soon to tell. So the web is indeed, if we're talking about coverage and exposure around suicide or around mental illness in general, I think the web is indeed where we need to focus our attention. And I actually am a believer that it has the potential for doing great good, quite apart from the pro-anorexia nervosa websites or the how to kill yourself websites, that it has the potential to link very isolated people and help them connect, but it presents new ethical dilemmas about being an electronic good Samaritan, and when do you respond when you come across messages of distress. I want to just shift a little bit to talk about more broadly portrayals of people with mental illness, as well as portrayals of the people who treat people with mental illness in our popular media. In our politically correct universe, I think that the last great exception is people with mental illness in terms of how we lampoon them, how we ridicule them, how we trivialize them. And this has been amply demonstrated in the world of children's literature, but I think you only need to turn on your television. And what you see is that people with mental illness, most commonly, are portrayed as dangerous. And certainly if you watch the most popular syndicated television series in the world, which is CSI, every person with a mental illness is an axe-wielding psychotic murderer, or idiotic, or romanticized into an inspired artist starving in a garret and writing symphonies for days on end. All of these, I believe, do disservice to the prosaic experience of people with mental illness, and by extension to their families, who have to bear the struggles of the people they care about, its ridicule in one form or another. I think, and I'm an optimist by nature, I think that that tide is starting to change, that depictions are becoming more realistic, that the voices of people with a whole variety of experience in mental illness are starting to be heard more commonly. But it's a slow shift. Somebody who had a little too much time on his hands did a study of New Yorker cartoons over a period of 50 years. And, you know, the New Yorker holds up a great barometer, I think, to social mores. And they looked at images of psychiatrists in New Yorker cartoons. Now, you know, looking at Andre and me, I was wondering which one of us looks more like the stereotype you might have of a psychiatrist. We may do a vote from the audience, but he's the guy with the beard and the fuzzy sweater, and, you know. But the point is, the classic cartoon image of a psychiatrist seeing a patient is very simple. It's the patient, usually a woman, sometimes a man, is on a couch. The psychiatrist, usually a man, is a balding guy with pince-nez and a Van Dyke, a large pencil, and a notepad. And one of the two of them is saying something ridiculous. It doesn't matter which one. Could be the patient, could be the doctor. And that is unchanged in 50 years. So it's serving some adaptive purpose. What is that purpose? I'll give you my own take on what that purpose is. There is no greater threat to our sense of personal identity and integrity than mental illness. If you break your leg, you're still you. If your mind is broken, you're no longer you in your own eyes and in the eyes of other people. And so one of the ways that we defang, declaw the threat of mental illness is to trivialize it, to lampoon it, and to also, similarly, make fun of the people who treat it. Because if they're all a bunch of idiots, how serious a threat can this possibly be? Somebody else with too much time on their hands looked at the portrayal of psychiatrists in the movies and broke them down into 3 different categories, which they found all the psychiatrists clustered into these 3 different categories, which they called Dr. Dippy, Dr. Evil, and Dr. Wonderful. And Dr. Dippy was the psychiatrist who was crazier than any of his patients possibly could be. My favorite example of this, because it's actually a very funny movie, is What's New Pussycat, where Peter Sellers, with a page boy haircut and a Lord Fauntleroy suit, plays a psychiatrist who, you know, is beyond the realm, always saying, "I think you wish to have sex with your mother," you know, things like that. Dr. Evil, now that serves the function of saying, well, how serious can this whole problem be if you've got this idiot like Peter Sellers as a psychiatrist? Dr. Evil is best personified by Brian De Palma's film Dressed to Kill, where Michael Caine played the psychiatrist who was actually murdering all his patients. And that plays into another fear about what these mind control doctors are going to do. And then Dr. Wonderful is best personified by Judd Hirsch in the film Ordinary People. And if any of you saw that film, Judd Hirsch played this warm, woolly, friendly psychiatrist who seemed to have only one patient, Timothy Hutton, and was available 24/7. Whenever this kid needed help, he was there. And unlike the repressed parents, Donald Sutherland and Mary Tyler Moore, when this kid needed a hug, there was the psychiatrist there to give him a hug. All of that warm, wonderful feeling, which is another kind of distortion and perhaps wish. So there is much headway to be made in how people with mental illness are depicted. But I have to say, in large measure, I would agree with André that we cannot collude in a conspiracy of silence about a phenomenon that affects 1 million people worldwide every year, 300,000 in China alone. And indeed, in China last year, there was a report of a possible Werther effect at the Foxconn communications factory, where they saw significant spikes in suicide after coverage in the Chinese media. So they're very much preoccupied with this issue now. On a more positive note, the opportunity for the media to acknowledge the progress, the hope, the recovery of people with mental illness and their families, as well as the voices that they bring to the table, is, I think, a great opportunity for breaking down the conspiracy of silence, the stigma, and the discrimination. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Could I ask you a question? Could you take a few minutes on the work of the commission so that we understand what that role is that you chair the commission, right? The Mental Health Commission?
The Mental Health Commission of Canada is now 5 years old, created in 2007, with a mission, a mandate, rather, given to it by the federal government to try to do 3 major tasks. Number one, to create a mental health strategy for Canada, because Canada's never had a national mental health strategy. That was launched in June of this year. Number two, to develop, to implement, and to evaluate a sustained and multidimensional anti-stigma, anti-discrimination campaign that is very much underway now and targeted at specific populations, children and youth, health professionals, where many people with mental illness and their families tell us they encounter a significant degree of stigma, and in the workforce. And so that's underway right now. The third thing was the creation of a national knowledge exchange center that would be virtual. That is up and running to provide, in the world of Web 2.0, where information is completely unfiltered, some filtered and high-quality information for the public, for people with mental illness, their families, and health professionals about mental illness and mental health. And also, in terms of additional things, the At-Home Chez Soi project, with which this hospital, St. Michael's, is intimately involved, the world's largest randomized trial of interventions for the homeless mentally ill. That study's coming to an end in April 2013. As I say, it's the largest study ever done, with a $110 million investment by the federal government in this research. The project is already being replicated in France. There are other countries interested in looking at it, and I think it will have a significant policy and health impact nationally and internationally. We also operate mental health first aid, which is a first aid course around mental health that's so far been responsible for training about 60,000 Canadians and runs in every province and territory of Canada. So the commission will sunset in 2017. We have a lot of work left to be done.
So then for you, Andre, is that what you expected?
Is that what I expected of the commission? Yeah, you know, I was someone who wrote a lot about, before it existed, the need for a strategy. And I think it's more of a philosophical view that if we don't plan things, if we don't measure them, then we can't improve. So yeah, I think generally the commission has gotten good reviews for what it's done so far. In terms of media coverage, you know, it was easy, the push for the creation, the getting going. Now it's sort of, it's in there, it's doing stuff day to day. It's not going to get as much coverage. So we're anxiously awaiting things like Chez Soi to see the results and what comes of that. Will people who are in these programs continue to be able to live in their homes, etc. So it's going to get a lot of coverage over time, but not the intense coverage as in the past.
So if you have questions, you can either move to the mic. Sarah's over there with a microphone, and I'm here with a microphone. So here we go. There's our first question.
David and Andre, thank you very much. Really, really informative. My question really has, in the context of the larger illness health debate, and more at an operational level. We hear lots of talk about diabetes and hip fractures and integration, alignment, realignment of the system. Would you comment on where mental health figures in that larger debate, more at the operational level than at the higher level strategic focus of your commission?
Well, if you were looking at where you could have the biggest impact, the biggest bang operationally, it wouldn't be in building more and bigger psychiatric hospitals. It would be about integrating appropriate recognition and treatment, and including multidisciplinary treatment for people with mental illness in the primary care sector. I think there will be no successful mental health reform without primary care reform. That's where most Canadians go to get their mental health care. And the reason why it's important to integrate it at that level is that we know for people with schizophrenia, for instance, that's 1 in 100 Canadians, their life expectancy right now is about 20 years shorter than people without schizophrenia. We know that their access to specialty cardiac care is way less than for people without schizophrenia. So that there are things to be done to improve the global health of people with mental illness that need to happen in the primary care sector. So I see things like the evolution of family health teams as one of the ways that we do this, but part of our anti-stigma initiative is indeed targeted at primary care health providers to make them more ready, more skilled, and more willing to work with people with mental illness because they're in their practices anyway. So that's where I think one of the most important changes needs to happen.
I would say roughly the same thing, that the future of the healthcare system reform is going to focus on this move from acute care to chronic care, and mental illness fits in like that as much as diabetes or heart disease or cancer. It's about moving care into the community, making it more patient-centered, looking at the determinants of health. We know that the single best thing we can do for people with severe mental illness is put a roof over their head. So I think those discussions, and that's the way the system is going, and it's going to benefit people with mental health issues as well as physical health issues. And hopefully we won't make the distinction anymore.
Sure. Oh, good morning. John Morris from BLG. Enjoyed your talk very much. Andre, this morning in your paper, there was a story about a teenager in China who self-immolated as a form of protest against, I guess, China's occupation of Tibet. So we've got an example, to me, as I read the article, it has a kind of imitative quality to it. We've also seen in the last 10 or 15 years a good deal of imitative, I think, behavior in terms of suicide bombing, something that we didn't have 20 or 30 years ago. Does that offer any insight into things that we should be thinking about? I take your point about shining a light on suicide and think those are very valuable messages, but do we have any concerns? Can sort of the study of these areas help us at all have any insight? Because even if we go back to the Werther effect that was talked about, there seems to be some evidence that people will engage in imitative behavior that relates to suicide.
Yeah, so there was in the last month, there's been 8 teenagers in Tibet who've self-immolated. So we have a feature on this in the Globe today. I don't think a lot of people in Tibet are reading the Globe, so I'm not too worried about imitative effect there, to be snide about it. But why? I think the question is, why do we write about that? It's because it's about a political issue. It's hard to not talk about the method. It's a political statement. It's been done for centuries by the Buddhist monk protesters, etc. So that's an example to me is what good would it do to not talk about the methodology. Same thing with suicide bombers. We don't have any problem writing about that. People don't, and I'm not sure that's suicide. I think that's something different. So I'm not sure it goes in the category. But to me, those are appropriate ways of covering them. I think we have to talk about the details there because they're relevant. So I'm not sure. What I hope is we just don't run a picture of someone or run on TV someone self-immolating without talking about the larger issue of Why is someone that desperate? What's going on in Tibet that they're being repressed, etc.? Again, it's all about context, how we write about these things.
Hi there, my name's Miriam. I wanted to first mention that the movie Heathers could very easily be added to your presentation. I don't know if you guys ever watched it, but it was big when I was growing up. It's about a group of teenagers who start sort of murdering their classmates, but making the murders look very much like suicide, which then sets off a trend of copycat suicides, at which point the person who sort of led the thing says, this is exactly what I wanted, and the one who was the accomplice says, I don't know if we actually wanted to get every single person in the school killing themselves this way. But it's from the 90s. It was just before Kurt Cobain, I looked it up, so he could have been imitating Heathers, presumably. But I was wondering, because I watched that movie when I was a teenager, and it helped me to think about suicide. And the thing that I remember from that movie very much was that at the time when I was a teenager, I was miserably unhappy. And it was a movie that dealt with the fact of my miserable unhappiness in a very lighthearted, acerbic, and intelligent manner. And that probably kept me from wanting to actually commit suicide. So the thing I've noticed in the media lately is that there's a real focus on teenagers being happy, or people being happy, or the pursuit of happiness as the end goal of everybody's life. And the reason suicide seems so shocking is it's because somebody has said, I don't believe I will ever be happy. Can you talk a bit about how not suicide, but how sorrow and depression are portrayed? And how that maybe is also something that needs to be part of the media's approach to mental illness?
Well, so I agree, Heathers was a great movie. It's fun. Yeah, I think that's an issue when we cover about, when we talked a lot about this at the Globe when we did these series about mental illness, is we don't ever talk about mental health, right? And that's the flip side of the coin. And it's much harder to write about. And in fact, it's much harder to write about positive things. When I started at the Globe, and as David let you know, that was in early 1890, my editor, one of my first editors, because when you're young and naive, you pitch stories that are positive. Hey, look at this great group, what they're doing. And he would always say, listen, the sun rising is not news, right? I don't want to hear about good stuff, normal stuff. We write about the bad things that go on in society, and that's still the attitude in the media. And I think that's changing a bit, but I think that's generally the approach. So it is much harder to write about the positive stuff. And I'm not sure people would read it. There's a lot of evidence that over the years there have been many happy papers that have been published. We're just going to publish positive news because the media is so negative. They're huge financial flops, those media tries. So I'm not sure exactly what to do with that. But you're right, there is an issue there about we don't talk about all the positive stuff about the mental health. And that's probably, and the Commission talks about this a bit too, that getting kids early and talking to them about having healthy habits, etc., is a really good prevention method, and there's pretty good research on that. I don't know if David, if you have anything to add on Heathers or otherwise.
Well, I never saw Heathers, so I'm sorry.
You can get it on YouTube.
Okay. No, I think that there has been a shift towards describing people's journeys out of adversity, people's experience of resilience, which is, we need to remind ourselves that when traumatic things happen, the most common human response is resilience, right? We've, in our celebration, if you will, or maybe celebration is not the right word, but our focus on victimization, right? We, I think, tend to obscure the fact that bad things are happening every day to all kinds of people. And the response is not a uniform one of inability to cope. We had a vogue 10 or 15 years ago around critical incident stress debriefing. I used to call these people vultures on pagers, who are waiting for fresh disaster to swoop in and provide a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to getting people to talk about this horrible thing that had happened, around the theory that talking about it would make it all better, until the research evidence showed that this did no good and in fact did some harm. And the process has been largely, but not exclusively, abandoned to a much more nuanced approach to helping people who are having a hard time versus other people who are making their own adaptation. And so I think there needs to be more celebration, indeed, of people's ability to adapt, to be resilient, to cope, not to minimize the adversity and not to minimize the consequences of a negative sort, but also to balance that with how people do manage to cope with things, because that's what daily life is about for most of us.
David, one more question, and for the audience, David is a great fan of Glenn Gould and was chair of what I guess is the Glenn Gould Society. But Glenn Gould clearly had huge issues. Is there a relationship between creativity and mental illness?
Okay, well, that's a great question. How much time do we have? There's a romanticized connection between mental illness and creativity. There is lots of evidence in studies of creative individuals and their families. This is the really interesting part, is the study of their families. Because if you look at creative individuals, is there an overrepresentation, particularly among writers, of a variety of mood disorders? The answer is yes. Creativity is also quite familial. And indeed, there's an overrepresentation of creative professions among the family members of creative individuals. What's interesting is that if somebody is creative and has a mental illness, their family members may have milder forms of mental illness that allow their creativity to surface more. For many creative people, mental illness is a barrier to the expression of their creativity. That treatment makes a difference in a positive way with regard to the expression of their creativity. And our tendency is to romanticize it, that it somehow fuels the creative process to be severely ill. It mainly inhibits it.
I'm seeing a workshop on that, David. It's 9 o'clock. I'd like to thank Accenture, who made this entirely possible, together with GE. And we appreciate our sponsors, but we certainly appreciate our speakers coming in from Montreal. André, much appreciated, and coming in from almost across the street, David. Much appreciate you coming here. Thank you for coming to Breakfast with the Chiefs.